Have you ever spent your life building something with loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet conviction, only to watch it be torn down by someone who never got their boots dirty? That question hit me harder than the discharge order sliding across the oak table in the Pentagon conference room. My name is Major Alex Rourke. I served in the U.S. Army for 20 years, 4 combat tours, a Bronze Star, and a commendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But none of that mattered when politics decided my career was inconvenient. It happened on a Thursday. I was scheduled to receive a Distinguished Service Medal during a strategy symposium in D.C., an invitation-only event attended by generals, senators, and defense contractors. My wife had flown in. My son had taken leave from Fort Benning to surprise me. But right before the ceremony, a junior officer approached with a manila folder and an apologetic look. Inside, an official memo signed by Deputy Director Alan Fisk. Major, Rourke is hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. No explanation, no court-martial, no respect. I stood there in my full-dress uniform, watching them shake hands and make speeches, while my career ended in silence. Or so they thought. I didn't always wear medals. I didn't join the army for applause or titles. I joined because my grandfather stormed Normandy. My father flew medevac in Vietnam, and I believed, maybe naively, that service still meant something. Over 20 years, I gave everything I had to that uniform. 4 tours, 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. I was the last one out of a forward operating base near Kandahar in 2010, after an IED nearly took off my leg. They gave me a Bronze Star for keeping my team alive that night. I never displayed it. When I transitioned to cyber operations in my late 30s, the battlefield changed, but the mission didn't. I led strategic defense programs that most civilians never heard about. My last major operation involved intercepting a Russian malware strain embedded in a naval logistics system, an attack that could have crippled our Pacific fleet without a single missile fired. It was classified, buried, and never mentioned. Again, they said I was in line for promotion, lieutenant colonel by next spring. I had been promised early retirement incentives, a civilian contract role afterward. They even floated a position with NATO Cyber Command. I wasn't looking for power, just peace. My wife Marisa had waited long enough. Our son had grown up with one parent at home, holidays spent watching me wave through laptop screens from air bases. But somewhere along the line, I made a fatal mistake. I said something I wasn't supposed to. 6 months before the discharge, I submitted a confidential report outlining irregularities in a defense contract awarded to Kestrel Dynamics, a private firm run by a retired general and closely connected to Deputy Director Alan Fisk. The numbers didn't add up. The deliverables were inflated. Field performance data had been quietly altered. I wasn't trying to make waves. I followed protocol, submitted it through secure channels, and moved on. But people like Fisk don't forget, and they certainly don't forgive. At first, it was subtle. A speaking engagement in Brussels got canceled. A joint task force I was supposed to lead was reassigned without explanation. Then came the meetings I wasn't invited to, promotions delayed, budget requests denied. Still, I kept my head down. I told myself it was politics, and politics always pass. But they didn't pass. They calcified. The worst part? I believed I was safe because I had value. I knew how to coordinate cyber defense operations across joint branches, spoke fluent Farsi from my deployments, and had deep relationships across NATO and Pacific allies. I had institutional memory that couldn't be Googled or replaced with a junior analyst, but none of that mattered in the end. They didn't need a reason to cut me out, just the paperwork and a quiet Friday morning. As I stood in that conference room, holding the discharge memo like it was someone else's mistake, the years began to unravel. Every scar, every compromise, every missed birthday. It wasn't just the end of a career. It felt like the Army had amputated part of my identity and told me to thank them for the privilege. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I nodded, left the building, and didn't say a word until I got into the car. Marisa looked at me and asked, "What did they do?" I said. They cut me loose. But what I didn't say, what I wouldn't fully realize until weeks later, was that they had also just made the biggest mistake of their careers. I thought that would be the end of it. A quiet dismissal, the kind they bury with sealed files and careful language. But the real blow came 2 weeks later. The Army hadn't just severed my service, they'd chosen to humiliate me. It happened during the National Strategic Defense Symposium in Washington, D.C., an annual gathering of the Pentagon's top brass, key legislators, foreign dignitaries, and defense industry insiders. I had been invited months in advance to speak on asymmetric cyber warfare in emerging conflict zones. It was to be my final public appearance in uniform, my professional curtain call before quietly transitioning into civilian life. At least that's what I thought. They gave me a seat in the front row directly across from the Secretary of the Army. My name was printed on the official program, along with a brief bio and a commendation for extraordinary operational leadership in theater and beyond. I had ironed my dress blues the night before. Marissa and our son Eric flew in from Colorado Springs. I even caught myself smiling when the color guard marched in. Then just before my panel began, a junior officer, one I didn't recognize, approached and knelt beside my seat. "Sir, I was instructed to hand-deliver this before your remarks." Slid a sealed envelope onto my lap. The seal was real. The language was official. The contents were devastating. Per Article 133, Conduct Unbecoming of an Officer. Recommendation for dishonorable discharge is hereby approved by Deputy Director, Fisk and General Counsel as of effective date. I read it 3 times. There was no explanation, no hearing, no record of trial, just a sentence, surgical and cold. My remarks were immediately canceled. I was escorted out of the hall under the pretense of a schedule adjustment, but everyone saw it. I caught the glance of General Hargrove, who had once called me the most mission-focused man I'd ever served with. He didn't say a word, just lowered his eyes. I didn't speak until we were back in the hotel. Eric was furious. "You've given your life to this country. What did they do to you?" Marissa didn't say anything. She just reached for my hand, and I realized for the first time that she wasn't surprised. She had seen it coming, maybe even before I had. The next morning it hit the defense circuit blogs. Decorated cyber operations officer discharged under classified conditions. No details, no rebuttal, just whispers. Dangerous ones. In our world, silence is guilt. Colleagues stopped returning calls. Speaking engagements vanished. One day I was being consulted on satellite encryption frameworks. The next, I was persona non grata. But there was one detail they hadn't counted on. A detail that would eventually become their undoing. You see, Alan Fisk had done all of this under the belief that I would go quietly, that the same discipline that made me loyal would also keep me docile. What he didn't realize was that discipline doesn't mean obedience to injustice. Fisk was clever, no doubt. He buried the discharge under administrative protocol, pushed it through legal back channels, and timed the ceremony to look like it was my farewell. On paper, it was airtight. But in truth, he'd fired me in front of 2 senators, 4 foreign delegates, and over a dozen private sector executives, all of whom had watched me be quietly removed from a stage I had earned. That wasn't a resignation. That was a message, but so was my silence. Because what Fisk didn't know, what he could never understand, was that I had already started connecting dots. And soon, I would do something the Army had trained me for better than any other skill. Would strategize, and I would strike. I spent the first week after the symposium doing nothing. No calls, no messages. I didn't touch a single official document. The uniform stayed zipped in its garment bag, hung in the back of the closet like a ghost. I sat on the porch of our home in Colorado Springs, watching the snow melt off the roof lines, drinking coffee that tasted like silence. It wasn't grief, not exactly. It was a kind of stillness that came from having everything taken from you and realizing you were still breathing. Marissa gave me space. She didn't ask what I planned to do because she knew I wouldn't answer until I was sure. But at night, when Eric had gone back to base, she'd sit next to me on the couch with her laptop closed and her hand resting on mine. Sometimes the most important battles are won by someone simply sitting with you while you think. On day 8, I opened my laptop. I didn't start with revenge, I started with clarity. First, I pulled my own service records. They had flagged me under internal review, but no formal charges had ever been filed. No Article 15, no court-martial. The dishonorable discharge had been processed as a recommendation under executive authority. Legal, but shaky. My security clearance hadn't even been formally revoked yet. That told me two things. They moved fast and they didn't clean up well. Then I turned to the procurement records for Kestrel Dynamics. I remembered them from a previous briefing. Defense. Contractors with a small office near Quantico, and a suddenly massive presence in the cyber defense budget. Their name appeared 37 times in the last fiscal quarter alone, tagged under various project codes. That wasn't abnormal. What was abnormal were the identical contract signatures appearing across multiple departments: Defense, Homeland Security, and Veterans Affairs, all tied to a subcontractor owned by someone named Nathaniel Fisk, Alan Fisk's brother. It was sloppier than I expected. The deeper I dug, the more patterns emerged. Inflated invoice cycles, fast-tracked testing approvals, performance reports recycled from unrelated systems. It was textbook procurement laundering. Hidden behind classified firewalls and tangled across 3 departments, it looked untouchable. But I had seen systems like this fail before. From the inside, I began mapping everything. A spiderweb of names, project codes, routing numbers. I built a dossier quietly, offline, encrypted on a burner drive with no traceable IP. I wasn't looking to expose them. Not yet. I wanted to understand how far the rot went before I moved, because once I struck, I wouldn't get a second chance. That's when I remembered an old contact, Captain Maya Chen. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. She was NSA back then, specializing in network penetration and SIGINT. Word was she left after refusing to rubber stamp a domestic surveillance project. Some said she burned out. Others said she got out before someone else burned her. I found her name buried on a website for a cybersecurity nonprofit out of Baltimore. I sent one line. "I think you'll want to see what I'm building." She replied within the hour. I didn't know it at the time, but that message would become the ignition point. Everything up until that moment, the discharge, the humiliation, the silence, had been the setup. Now came the strategy. Because if the Army had trained me to fight with honor, Alan Fisk had just taught me something even more valuable. How to dismantle a corrupt empire, one quiet, deliberate move at a time. I met Maya Chen in person 12 days after I sent that message. We didn't meet in DC or Baltimore. She suggested a coffee shop just outside Richmond, neutral ground, low traffic, no digital footprint. She arrived exactly on time, wearing jeans, a gray field jacket, and the same razor-sharp calm I remembered from our last joint task force briefing in Bahrain. Back then, she was all business, even when mortar fire echoed just beyond the wire. Today the fire was still there, but it burned quieter. She didn't bother with small talk. "You said you were building something?" she said, setting her phone face down on the table. "Show me." I handed her the encrypted drive and waited, while she scanned through the folders. Her eyes didn't move like someone reading, they moved like someone confirming what she already suspected. When she looked up, her voice was different. Lower. Tighter. "This is worse than I thought." I nodded. "You've seen parts of this before?" "Some, but never in one place. We've had pieces, flagged invoices, discrepancies in supply chain reporting, but it was always fragmented. Fisk knew how to bury paper trails across departments. What you've got here is the full body." I leaned back. "Can it be used?" She hesitated. "Not yet. Not without someone credible to stand behind it. Someone from inside the command structure. Someone they can't discredit." I said nothing. She didn't need me to answer. She already knew what I was thinking. "You realize they'll come after you if this goes public," she said. "They already did," I replied. "This isn't about revenge, Maya. This is about fixing something that's gone rotten." She studied me for a long time. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded document. "What is this?" I asked. "A sealed subpoena request," she said. "Senate Subcommittee on Armed Services. They've been quietly investigating procurement abuse for over a year. I've been feeding them what I can, but it's never been enough to trigger a full hearing. Until now. I opened the document and scanned the request. My name was already listed, pre-typed under potential witness. I didn't agree to testify, I said. She didn't flinch. You didn't have to. I just need to know if you're... And it wasn't an easy answer. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood what was at stake. I knew how fast people in DC could bury the truth. I'd seen good men lose everything for doing the right thing. But I also knew the difference between regret and resolve. I'm in, I said. She smiled for the first time. Then let's give them a reason to panic. Over the next few weeks, we worked quietly. Maya brought in 2 more trusted analysts, both former military intelligence, both fed up with the same system that had tossed us aside. We didn't hack. We didn't leak. We built. Methodically. Strategically. Like a field op. At the same time, I started rebuilding something else. My name. I filed to establish Iron Watch Solutions, a private cyber defense consultancy structured as a veteran-owned entity. I knew the federal pipeline, I knew how to write bids, and I knew how to build a team that didn't flinch under pressure. Fisk thought he had erased me from the defense world. What he didn't realize was that the only thing more dangerous than a man who's been betrayed is a man who's just found a mission, and I had just found mine. Launching Iron Watch wasn't about revenge, not at first. It started as a survival move, somewhere to pour my skills, discipline, and restless focus before they turned inward. But the moment the website went live, with nothing more than a mission statement and a contact form, the calls started coming in, not from friends, not from former commanders, from clients. 1 week after we registered, a mid-sized defense manufacturing firm out of Virginia reached out. They'd lost a cyber compliance bid to Kestrel Dynamics, Fisk's firm, despite having superior technical metrics. They smelled something off. I reviewed the tender, cross-referenced it against procurement timelines, and found the same pattern I'd seen in half a dozen other contracts. Backdated performance specs, inflated cost estimates, and an evaluation, panel stacked with Fisk's contacts. We didn't tell them that. Instead, I showed them how to harden their internal systems, clean up their audits, and resubmit under a separate NATO subtender. 3 weeks later, they landed a $6 million contract, clean, legitimate, and without a single backroom conversation. Word traveled fast. By the end of month 2, Iron Watch had 6 clients, all by referral. 2 were defense-adjacent companies with prior rejections. 1 was a data infrastructure provider for military field hospitals. None of them cared that I had been dishonorably discharged. They cared that I delivered results and that I didn't lie. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Maya and I continued compiling evidence. We anonymized data, cleaned metadata trails, and timestamped every document. We used burner servers, dead drops, and old-school courier services, anything to keep our work below the surface. And then came the break we hadn't planned for. A contract officer from inside the Department of Defense, someone still active, reached out to Iron Watch anonymously. They didn't give a name. Just a file. It was a procurement summary for a new cybersecurity initiative labeled Project Helios. $148 million single-source contract, awarded to Kestrel Dynamics under expedited clearance. No competing bids, no open call. Inside the zip file was something else. Internal memos suggesting that Fisk was using Project Helios as leverage to secure a promotion to Assistant Secretary of Defense. That changed everything. This wasn't about sidelining me anymore. Fisk was using his position to climb even higher, dragging half the defense tech sector into his shadow. It was time to act. We contacted the Senate subcommittee through encrypted channels and scheduled a preliminary witness review. Maya submitted her affidavit. I provided a detailed breakdown of 5 specific contract irregularities, supported by verifiable public records and insider memos. We didn't accuse. We outlined. Let the dots connect themselves. The chair of the committee responded. In 6 words, this is enough. We're moving forward. While the legal machine began to spool up, I focused on one final step: cutting off Fisk's influence at the source, his client base. I began reaching out directly to the companies still tied to Kestrel Dynamics, firms I'd once worked with under my Army command. I wasn't aggressive, I didn't throw accusations, I asked one question. Are you getting what you paid for? More often than not, the answer was no. Within 3 months, Ironwatch Solutions had absorbed over $28 million in redirected contracts, each one legally secured, transparently executed, and built on performance, not politics. Fisk had fired me, blacklisted me, and buried my name. But what he didn't understand was simple. He took my title. I took his foundation. And brick by brick, it was beginning to collapse. It began, as all collapses do, with silence. The kind of silence that creeps into secure conference rooms when someone asks a question no one wants to answer. The Senate subcommittee formally opened its inquiry into Kestrel Dynamics and its affiliations with Department of Defense officials. It wasn't announced with headlines or press conferences. It began quietly, behind closed doors under heavy redactions, just loud enough for the right people to hear. But once the subpoenas landed, the noise became impossible to ignore. Fisk's name appeared in the first round of document requests. So did Nathaniel's. So did half the contracting chain responsible for Project Helios. Within 2 weeks, the story leaked. Defense Insider ran a cautious headline. Senate opens ethics review into cyber defense contracts. They didn't name names, but the timing, and the $148 million in question, left little to the imagination. The next day, my phone lit up. Not with threats, with congratulations, but I wasn't celebrating, not yet, because while the investigation churned in the background, something more satisfying was happening in real time. Fisk's influence was eroding, client by client, relationship by relationship. It started with Cerberus Logistics. They'd been a longtime subcontractor for Kestrel, providing back-end support for encrypted file transport. I'd worked with their COO years ago in Ramstein. She called me directly. Alex, we just received a guidance notice recommending we pause ongoing development with Kestrel pending audit. Is this what I think it is? It's exactly what you think it is, I said. And it's only the beginning. The following week, 2 additional clients pulled out of their Kestrel contracts mid-cycle. Ironwatch picked up one. The other moved to an independent provider. Then came the internal shift, the part Fisk never saw coming. One of his senior compliance officers resigned unexpectedly and submitted a whistleblower statement to the subcommittee. She attached emails, audio logs, and call transcripts. In one recording, Fisk could be heard discussing how to circumvent review cycles and leverage overseas clearance frameworks. That's when the headlines changed. Now they used his name, DoD Undersecretary, linked to suspicious contract activity. Fisk faces Senate inquiry into ethics violations. And still, he didn't blink. He pushed back, called the investigation a political stunt, claimed unfounded retaliation from disgruntled former personnel. I was never named publicly, but I didn't need to be, because while Fisk battled the optics, I kept building. Ironwatch had now expanded to a team of 27, mostly veterans, former cyber officers, and a few sharp civilian analysts who knew how to operate without ego. We weren't a startup. We were a strike team with a mission, and word was spreading fast. One morning I walked into our new office. Bare day, walls, folding chairs, coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and found a stack of signed contracts waiting on my desk. One of them came from a firm that had been locked in exclusivity with Kestrel for 4 years. I didn't have to ask why they switched. They were tired of politics. They wanted performance. And then it happened. Fisk was removed from his role, pending ongoing review. It was written in passive voice, but everyone understood what it meant. He wasn't coming back. Maya texted me the next morning. The system flinched. You hit the nerve. I stared at that message for a long time, because it wasn't just about bringing Fisk down. It was about proving that in a world run by quiet corruption, a man with nothing to lose could still make the ground shake. When the official letter came from the Department of the Army, it was short, almost cold in tone. a formal retraction of my discharge citing procedural irregularities and ongoing findings from a congressional review. My status was restored retroactively, including full pension rights and clearance eligibility. No apology. No acknowledgement of the public humiliation. Just the administrative undoing of a decision that never should have happened. I wasn't surprised. The Army rarely admits its mistakes out loud. But the paper meant something, if only because it proved I hadn't imagined what had been taken from me. They offered reinstatement, same rank, new position, and the option to command a cyber operations unit focused on emerging threats. I said no. I didn't leave because I lost faith in the mission. I left because I'd already found a better one. Iron Watch had grown into something real, something alive. We weren't just taking contracts. We were training young veterans, building ethical defense systems, and restoring trust between clients and cybersecurity providers. We didn't wear uniforms, but we served all the same. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a closed-door industry roundtable hosted by the Senate subcommittee. Maya was there. So was the chair. We weren't there to gloat. We were there to brief legislators on how easily corruption exploits complexity and how dangerous silence becomes when it's institutionalized. After the session, the chair pulled me aside. "You did more than hold a mirror up to the system," she said. "You reminded it that accountability still has a voice." I didn't respond right away. Maybe because I didn't feel heroic. Maybe because I was still haunted by how close I came to losing everything for telling the truth. But I knew she was right. One morning I got a call from an old squad mate. We hadn't spoken in years. He had heard about Iron Watch and wanted to know if I was hiring. He didn't even ask about what happened. He just said, "You always led. From the front. Figured you still were." I hired him on the spot. Later that month, Marissa and I stood on the balcony of our new office building, a modest two-story structure overlooking the edge of downtown Denver. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We're just getting started." Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about restoring something deeper than a career. Something the Army had taught me long before politics interfered. That leadership isn't about rank. It's about protecting the people who trust you, even when the system doesn't. The institution I gave my life to had nearly broken me, but it also gave me the tools to rebuild, and I intended to use every single one. In the end, it wasn't the investigation that brought me peace. It wasn't Fisk's removal, the Senate hearing, or even the reversal of my discharge. It was watching something honest grow in a space where corruption once thrived. Justice doesn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it moves, slowly, silently, through one decision, one truth, one act of courage at a time. And when it does arrive, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like clarity. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Institutions aren't inherently good or bad. They reflect the people who lead them. And when those people forget who they serve, it's up to someone, anyone, to remind them. Even if that someone has been pushed out, written off, or told to stay quiet. So here's a question I'll leave you with. Have you ever stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent? Let me know in the comments. Your stories matter more than you think. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're interested in hearing more stories where truth meets consequences, you know what to do. Stick around. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the longest echoes.